Good afternoon and welcome to our program featuring Joshua Botts with the State Department's Office of the Historian. Today's conversation will include a presentation on the history of the Foreign Relations Series, which began in 1861 under Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, William H. Seward. My name is Phyllis Evans and I am the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. As many of you may have heard, our foundation is taking on a new role, leading and supporting efforts across the nation and perhaps the world to share the story of Abraham Lincoln's life, legacy, and leadership. As part of the relaunch, the foundation has changed its name and adopted a new brand, which allows us to achieve a broader and new mission. We hope that you will continue in your support of this new mission as we continue moving forward with our commitment to the unfinished work of our time. For more information, please visit our new website at lincolnpresidential.org. I know you're all really going to enjoy today's program, so before we get started, just a couple of things. I want to let you know that as always, we will entertain questions in the Q&A box below, so please be sure and insert those there, and we'll get to those as many as we can. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, and thank you for joining us for today's program. We're joined by Joshua Botts, who serves as the Chief of the Special Projects Division in the Office of the Historian at the U.S. Department of State. In that capacity, he focuses on providing institutional history support within the State Department. He has, however, contributed to the Foreign Relations Documentary History series that we will learn about today, both as a compiler. He worked on the 1981 to 1984 Reagan National Security Policy volume, and as a member of a team of historians who developed recommendations for future FRUS volumes documenting the Clinton administration. He joins us today because he was a part of a team of historians that his predecessor, Bill McAllister, led 11 years ago to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Foreign Relations of the U.S. series by researching and writing an official history of the series. You'll note that was during the Civil War sesquicentennial, and indeed this series began during President Lincoln's administration, as Phyllis mentioned. I had the great fortune of hosting a program back then at which one of Josh's colleagues spoke. That history, done for the 150th, is published on the history.state.gov website, and Josh will provide a link to the full study at the end of his presentation for anyone who wants to dive deeper into FRUS's backstory after today's talk. Josh joined the office in 2010 after completing his doctorate in the history of U.S. foreign relations at the University of Virginia in 2009. Now, foreign relations is an evergreen topic, but one that has been at the forefront of international conversations in recent weeks as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and debate over the national and international response to it. Drawing attention to important resources like the Foreign Relations of the U.S. series is an important part of our mission as a foundation dedicated to understanding not only the past, but how it informs present context and decision-making today. It's important we understand what information is available, where, and how to access it so we can be informed citizens. Josh, we are so delighted to have you here with us today to teach us more about this very important resource in history. Welcome. Take it away, Josh.
Thanks, Erin, for that introduction and for this opportunity to share the history of FRUS with a new audience. And let me also welcome that new audience. Your presence is an important sign that the Foreign Relations series matters today to all kinds of people around the world. This afternoon, I want to trace two themes that illuminate how the Foreign Relations series changed during its 161-year history. First, I will describe how the purpose, scope, and content of the series evolved in the years between its origins during the Civil War and today. Second, I will take a brief look at the development of the increasingly complex processes used by the Department of State and other agencies to review material selected for publication. Looking at these two themes together offers a compelling picture of the ways FRUS has mattered historically, both as a tangible product, providing important benefits to a wide range of consumers, and a driver of institutional change to deliver government transparency. In 1861, FRUS started as a mechanism of contemporary accountability within the separation of powers established under the Constitution. In the 1920s, it became an instrument of historical transparency. Why did it start out as a release mechanism with contemporary importance? And how did it end up becoming something else? From the earliest days of the Federal Republic, the executive branch responded to congressional requests for information about the execution of policy by sharing what it deemed prudent. It also withheld information whose release the executive believed would harm the public interest. During the Civil War, Secretary of State William Seward adapted these practices to also serve another important objective: informing the public about the Union's diplomatic efforts to defeat the Confederacy. By publishing diplomatic documents rather than submitting them to Congress, Seward supported the Lincoln administration's domestic messaging on war aims, cultivated his own reputation as diplomat-in-chief, and pursued public diplomacy to constrain foreign decision makers who might be tempted to support the Confederacy. The first Fruce volume embodied much of the department's congressional relations, public affairs, and public diplomacy work at the outset of the Civil War. And that's the equivalent of 4 bureaus in today's department. Over the next 4 decades, the department continued producing Fruce according to the precedents established in 1861. Clerks and senior career officials, like longtime Second Assistant Secretary of State Alvy Addy, selected and redacted documentation as they conducted the day-to-day business of the department. Volumes contain correspondence between the department and diplomatic posts, and notes between the United States and foreign governments. They documented the conduct of diplomacy, but not the decision-making process. They occasionally stirred political controversies. Congress and public audiences grew accustomed to the red books, and US diplomats and consular officials abroad valued the series as a ready reference. Indeed, in 1925, Assistant Secretary John McMurray insisted that the department pay for enough copies to supply all posts because, quote, it would be as impossible for a consul to conduct the business of his office properly without a set of foreign relations as it would be for a carpenter to get along without a hammer and saw, end quote. So why did this change? In 1906, the perennial Fruce publication lag began and grew for 2 reasons: printing costs and personnel turnover. In 1908, once Secretary of State Elihu Root realized that his instructions the previous year to release the 1906 volumes had been ignored, he ordered the resumption of near contemporaneous publication. But with Congress continuing to tighten printing budgets, the department could not satisfy that directive before the outbreak of World War I. No one intended for Fruce to lag, but by the early 1920s, department officials began asking existential questions. Should the series continue? If so, should it change? In 1924, Dr. Tyler Dennett answered both questions. Dennett was the first professionally trained historian recruited to take charge of Fruce and other department publications. He prepared formal editorial principles to govern the production of the series. In addition to requiring that redactions be indicated in the text, Dennett created a new mandate for the series to cover the decision-making process, at least within the Department of State. Notably, the heads of all the department's various geographic and functional divisions and offices reviewed these editorial guidelines, and Secretary of State Frank Kellogg approved them. By insisting that Fruce editors document not only the policies that were implemented, but also the alternatives considered, Dennett traded timeliness for comprehensiveness and transformed the character of the series. Indeed, Dennett's editorial guidelines continue to govern the series. They are included in the preface of every published volume nearly a century later. Over the ensuing decades, as Fruce editors worked to fulfill this new historical transparency mission, decision makers outside the department at times tried to turn back the clock and again employ Fruce as a contemporary or near contemporary instrument of public diplomacy and political accountability. During World War II, for example, President Franklin Roosevelt pushed for peace and war volumes that documented the path to war in the Pacific. And in the 1950s, Republican Senate Majority Leader William Nolan pushed Secretary of State John Foster Dulles to accelerate production and publication of volumes on controversial topics, Roosevelt's wartime diplomacy and US policy toward China in the 1940s. In both cases, the experiments with reviving a more contemporaneous Rus failed. Reviewers dismissed the peace and war volumes as propaganda, and the Yalta volume generated backlash, both at home and abroad. More on the Yalta volume later. Instead, the series followed Dennett's roadmap. As Rus historians chased documentation of wartime diplomacy and the interagency decision-making processes established during the early Cold War with the creation of the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency, volumes began increasingly relying on records from outside the State Department. At first, these were documents that simply made their way into department files. But over time, Rus compilers sought greater access to records from the Pentagon, presidential libraries, and other agencies, eventually including those in the intelligence community. The interagency breadth of the series had important repercussions for the declassification of the series, which I will turn to shortly. Simultaneously, developments like the establishment of the Historical Advisory Committee, the HAC, in the late 1950s, and the increasing publication lag confirmed that Rus would remain a historical publication. Still, champions of the series insisted that it could continue to serve contemporary political interests. During the late 1960s, for example, as anti-war sentiments swelled across college campuses, historical office leadership and the HAC lobbied department leaders to invest the resources necessary to accelerate Rus production so that volumes could counter Cold War revisionism. Although Secretary of State Dean Rusk did not surge Rus as part of the Johnson administration's effort to sell the Vietnam War at home, he got the message. After leaving the department, he predicted that Rus volumes would fuel, quote, correctives, unquote, to those who blamed the United States for the Cold War. In the early 1980s, the HAC again urged the department to accelerate Rus to enable scholars to write, quote, fair and comprehensive histories, unquote, and promote, quote, our collective national security interests, unquote. In response to Committee Chair Ernest May's 1983 report, Secretary of State George Shultz secured a 1985 presidential directive for interagency cooperation for an ambitious publication program, including accelerated preparation of volumes covering the Vietnam War during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Despite these political motivations, editorial objectivity had been institutionalized in the Rus production process. The release of Rus volumes afforded more access to US archives for scholars, but this seems to have reinforced interpretive pluralism, not the kinds of correctives that Rusk hoped for in the history of US foreign policy. Sustaining Rus's historical transparency mission amidst the growing interagency scope and exploding volume of records relevant to the foreign policy decision-making process required editorial innovation from the 1950s onward. As they faced these challenges, senior managers in the Historical Office and members of the Historical Advisory Committee considered serious questions. Foremost among them was, how could the series continue to provide the public with the documentation required to understand the development and conduct of foreign policy within anticipated staffing and budget constraints? Within the Historical Office, managers sometimes pushed poorly received experiments with quote unquote innovative publication formats like microfiche and internet-only volumes to publish more documents more cheaply. What proved most effective, however, was a combination of greater selectivity in choosing documents and expanded use of annotation to reference and characterize documents that could not be printed. The growing value of such annotation in relation to printed documentation placed a premium on recruiting skilled historians to compile Rus and careful initiatives to refine editorial guidance and practice. Without both, and the constant support, assistance, and advice offered by helpful records managers and knowledgeable archivists, the series would have been overwhelmed by an archival avalanche. So I've shown you how the mission of the series shifted and the content of volumes evolved over the course of the late 19th and 20th centuries. Now I want to explain how the Department of State and eventually other parts of the United States government, developed new standards and processes for balancing conflicting interests in security and transparency as they decided whether to release documents selected for publication in FRUS. The practices governing who would be allowed to participate in the clearance process were vitally important for determining how that balance was struck. For example, during and immediately after the Civil War, as US diplomats argued that they should have the discretion to decide which of their communications were suitable for publication and which should be withheld, successive secretaries of state, even those like Hamilton Fish, who started out skeptical of FRUS, insisted on exercising authority over the contents of volumes. During the early 20th century, the department's bureaucratic specialization spawned geographic and functional components whose responsibility for managing aspects of US foreign relations lent weight to their judgments about the potential costs of releasing historical information. In government parlance, these components now had equity in decisions about releasing information, and so they were invited to participate in the clearance process for coordinating approval of such decisions. Although Dennett's revised editorial guidelines garnered universal support in principle from the heads of such components in 1925, the clearance difficulties that he encountered over the next several years drove him out of the department. As the department established new offices, divisions, and bureaus organized around a growing range of specialized policy portfolios, it also diffused decision-making authority for releasing information in FRUS. This general framework of identifying bureaucratic equities has remained ever since. Within the State Department, the FRUS clearance process was decentralized at the working level between the 1920s and 1981. Classified drafts went to desk officers who reviewed them as the day-to-day business of conducting diplomacy allowed. These officers censored information they believed would complicate current initiatives or reflect badly on influential individuals. When FRUS historians appealed to more senior level officials to reverse redactions and denials they considered excessive, such appeals tended to eventually succeed, but at the cost of protracted delays. Through this process, FRUS clearance reviews also established guidelines to govern the release of other department records. FRUS was the de facto systematic declassification review program, as well as a mechanism for publishing selected highlights from the department's holdings. In 1980, the department replaced this decentralized system with a centralized declassification review staff. This restructuring got off to a rocky start when, instead of streamlining a process everyone agreed worked poorly, the new declassification reviewers instead caught serious problems in the quality of completed reviews of FRUS volumes scheduled for imminent publication. Desk officers had missed sensitive information about emergency war planning that should have been redacted. When one such volume covering national security policy during 1951 proved impossible to claw back before it was released, the geographic bureaus withdrew all previous clearances and insisted upon a re-review of unpublished volumes. David Trask, the director of the historian's office, appealed this decision through the dissent channel to no avail, and the new declassification staff gained total control over the declassification of FRUS volumes. Within that structure, however, senior officials retained final authority over how to balance security and transparency. This often worked in favor of greater transparency. Senior officials, especially political appointees, were more likely to understand the interests of civil society stakeholders in the release of historical information, and to perceive the tangible and reputational benefits of openness, both at home and abroad. In 1954, Dulles overruled geographic bureaus and approved the declassification of State Department documents in the Yalta compilation. In the late 1970s, Assistant Secretary Richard Holbrooke allowed a volume on China policy in 1949 to move forward after a multi-decade delay by the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And in the mid-1990s, Undersecretary for Management Richard Moose overruled 2 geographic bureaus to clear the way within the department to releasing documentation about historical covert actions. This decision reflected the influence of Tom Donilon, dual-hatted as the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, which oversaw FRUS at the time, and Secretary of State Warren Christopher's Chief of Staff. Donilon assured Moose that the Secretary supported this decision. Within the State Department, equities shifted from decentralized to centralized, but ultimate authority rested at the top and often tipped the scales in favor of greater transparency. The interagency story was more fraught. Appealing unfavorable decisions outside the department required bureaucratic escalation and persuasion rather than compulsion. During the preparation of the Yalta volume in 1954 and 1955, State Department officials accepted that the Department of Defense had the authority to withhold military documentation vital to the compilation, but strongly objected when DoD justified denials on the grounds of foreign relations sensitivity rather than national defense. In their minds, DoD had equities for documents they originated, but could not overrule the State Department on foreign policy questions. By the 1970s and 1980s, however, the FRUS declassification process handled interagency equities in ways that devolved considerably more power to decision makers outside the State Department, even for the content of State Department records. The Central Intelligence Agency, for example, could and did define a broad scope for its authority over intelligence sources and methods, and exerted this control no matter which agency originated documents. Covert actions, of course, were a special case in the interagency declassification process. And their treatment in FRUS illustrates the critical importance of designing procedures that reflect the nature of equities held by different actors in the bureaucracy. The question of whether to include covert action documentation in the series had first arisen in the late 1970s, and FRUS historians received an emphatic no when they sought to include the limited documentation about covert actions that they could access at that time. This no came from two different places: consultations with CIA and declassification denials on specific volumes issued by the State Department's centralized declassification staff. After the passage of the FRUS statute in 1991, and Director of Central Intelligence Bob Gates's public acknowledgement of several Cold War era covert actions in 1992, FRUS historians and members of the HAC were exasperated when they continued to receive denials within the State Department and from the CIA when Kennedy subseries volumes containing covert action materials were reviewed. While Moose's decision described earlier eventually cleared the way forward within the State Department, the CIA continued to say no. Reviewers there did not believe they had the authority to release any information about activities that a president had ordered to remain covert unless that order had been explicitly reversed and the activity acknowledged. Because the National Security Council had previously only reviewed documents that all the other agencies had already agreed to release, the White House had never had the chance to weigh in on whether a particular covert action could be acknowledged during the existing declassification process. It took several years of patient, painstaking effort from Tom Donilon, his counterparts at the CIA and the NSC staff, and their successors to devise new procedures. The new process created a high-level panel, a group of senior officials that would make acknowledgement decisions at the beginning of the declassification process for volumes covering covert actions. Their decisions then provided policy guidance that agency reviewers applied as they reviewed selected documentation. Although this high-level panel process requires officials across multiple agencies to invest significant time and attention to yield results, it has led to the acknowledgement of 64 covert actions and other sensitive intelligence activities over the last quarter century. Interagency equities and the declassification processes they yielded, in short, were devilishly complicated, frequently fraught, and dependent on goodwill and hard work to sustain. Finally, there was one other area where defining declassification equities and building a process around them proved consequential for the series: information that had come from foreign governments. US policy toward foreign government equities evolved considerably over the course of the 20th century. At first, Proust historians and other department officials agreed that only documents originating from foreign governments should be cleared with those governments prior to publication. Other governments, particularly the British, resented this policy because it gave them no role whatsoever in the much wider range of US documents that reported the substance of conversations with foreign officials or diplomats. This dispute came to a head with the Yalta volume, which included combined chiefs of staff documents where the United States recognized British equities and US notes of Roosevelt summit meetings quoting Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden, which the State Department insisted were not subject to British review. The British used the leverage they derived from their equities in the jointly originated documents to prevent the release of US documents containing their information. Jammed between impatient senators and adamant allies, Secretary Dulles actually leaked the volume in March 1955. Although the department reconsidered its procedures for reviewing foreign government information in the aftermath of the leak, it still stuck to the traditional narrow definition for another quarter century. In the early 1980s, however, the department expanded its definition of foreign government equities to include any foreign government information that was found in US documents. The declassification staff began consulting with friendly governments, both to reach a consensus about general principles that each side could apply to reviewing the other country's information in their own documents, and to refer specific borderline documents that were neither clearly sensitive nor clearly safe to release. Subsequent executive orders reinforced this shift toward greater protection for foreign government information. These changes affected some Proust volumes, but have had a much greater impact on the systematic review of records due to be released at the National Archives. Now, I've talked a lot about how officials throughout the government contribute to the Proust declassification process. But what makes the series so vital is that historians have the power to determine whether the information that policymakers agree can be released is sufficient to document how major foreign policy decisions were made and implemented. All of us in the Office of the Historian and the members of our advisory committee take this responsibility incredibly seriously. If a volume emerges from the declassification process with gaps that render the publishable documentation misleading, we have two choices under the Proust statute. We can delay publication and pursue declassification appeals to try to fill in those gaps, or we can alert readers that the volumes do not meet the statutory mandate for the series, which is to provide thorough, accurate, and reliable documentation because critical information remains classified. Because the Proust statute gives historians the final say about whether the history that can be declassified is thorough, accurate, and reliable, the series represents a unique and vital part of the US government's transparency machinery. So let me conclude by offering some impressions of how and why all of this mattered. Proust has always been important in terms of its value as a tangible resource for US government documents. Its systemic role as the catalyst for opening other records, and as a symbol of enduring national values. Proust volumes have at times served as instruments for fulfilling the constitutional obligations of the executive branch, vital references for the conduct of diplomacy within the department, catalysts for the opening of the rest of the department's records, and handy teaching and research tools in universities around the world. Their content reflects both editorial judgments that the actions and decisions recorded in selected documents were historically significant enough to warrant publication, and policy judgments that the information contained in those documents could be responsibly released by the US government. The process is built to generate, review, and implement these editorial and policy judgments embody their own rich story of institutional formation and adaptation. It's a story of the continual push and pull between different sectors of the bureaucracy, political leaders, and members of the public over questions of transparency, diplomacy, and security. Thanks for letting me introduce the history of Proust to you this afternoon. I look forward to answering your questions as best I can.
Joshua, thank you so much for being generous with your time and your research. That was a very comprehensive overview. We have some questions coming in here, but to get us started on the Q&A portion, the Foreign Relations of the U.S. series began publication in the midst of a domestic war, the United States Civil War. Though it was certainly a domestic issue with considerable international interest and implications embedded in it, representative government was still very uncommon at that time in our world. And there were expectations by some, including the United Kingdom, the British government, that this experiment in American democracy would fail. So I'm curious, based on your work, which has been more influential to the history of the development of the foreign relations of the US series? Is it domestic issues with or conflicts with international concern or interest, or international issues and conflict of domestic concern? And then a follow-up to that being, was there a point where that line blurred so much as to be irrelevant?
That's a great question. That's a great way to kind of think about kind of the sources of some of the motivations that I kind of breezed over in my presentation. I think it's a mixture of both, but it's fundamentally an expression of this kind of constitutional relationship, right? When the minister to London, Charles Francis Adams, complained to Secretary of State William Seward in 1862 that, hey, my communications to you are being published. This is making things awkward here in London. The secretary responded and said, you know what, there's a constitutional obligation that we have to explain to the American people what we're doing in their name. And I've chosen to fulfill that obligation by publishing the documents so people can see what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. That kind of underlying kind of sense of kind of obligation, a transparency obligation lies at the heart of the proof series from its beginning up through the statute, and it continues to, I think, inspire all of us today. That said, the character of the series does reflect kind of both domestic and international influences, right? Over time, especially as it became more and more a resource for scholars and less of a kind of a product for Congress, the kinds of questions that people tried to answer by referencing the series changed. And that kind of coincides with the Dennett's effort to include the decision-making process in the volumes, make them more useful for historians. So there's this kind of demand side kind of push for the series to evolve. At the same time, there are foreign governments who are paying attention to this the whole time and asking questions about why the United States is choosing to publish particular documents at particular times and ascribing a political significance to those decisions that those decisions didn't always have. There's an example in the 1920s or in the 1930s, the department was preparing volumes covering the 1920s that touched upon sensitive issues in the bilateral relationship with Japan. And the Japanese government protested and said, we don't want you to publish this. It's going to make our effort to iron out some of these differences a lot harder. And when the Department of State responded that, you know, this information has already actually been released in a former Secretary of State's memoirs, the Japanese government came back and said, well, we should have been given the opportunity to clear those memoirs. So there's kind of influences from both sides that have really played a really important role in both the content of the series and the decision-making around it.
That's really fascinating, Josh. So we have a question from Stephen who asks, Robert Farrell's American Diplomacy was once considered the gold standard of US diplomatic history. Is it still? Are there more modern alternatives?
There's a rich literature on the history of American foreign relations. I can't provide any official Department of State recommendations, but there's a recent book by George Herring in the Oxford History of the United States series, From Colony to Superpower. That's a pretty good kind of overview. And I would refer you to the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. That's the professional organization of US diplomatic historians who may be able to kind of point you toward other kind of similar synthetic works.
Great. The next question is from Bill, who's tuning in from California. And he notes that he missed the introductions, but we didn't cover this anyway, so it's still a great question. He wasn't sure. But he asks what your daily activities look like in the Office of the Historian.
So I can answer that for myself, but I can also kind of answer that for the people in my office who actually work on producing the Foreign Relations series, which might be more connected to the talk. So a FRUS historian, it's a dream job for a historian, right? We're research hounds. We want to kind of dig into documents, dig into other sources, and try to learn about what happened in the past, how it happened, why it happened. And the FRUS series gives us like really extraordinary, unique access to the records of the foreign policy apparatus of the US government. We see the records before they're shipped to the National Archives. We have the clearances required to look at the full range of the documents. And so most of people's day-to-day work is working with those documents. And there's a very long and complex process built around FRUS. So you first try to plan your research, figure out what collections are going to be the most relevant for a given volume, whose records are going to help you document that decision-making process. You go to those repositories, you collect the information, you bring it back to our office, and you sit down and you organize it for yourself. And then you embark on that annotation process that I described, where you take the documents that you're planning to print in the volumes or put on our website, and you provide additional supplementary information drawn from other documents and other resources to help readers make sense of that document in its context. And then after you do that annotation, you pass it along to another historian in our office to review. And there's 2 stages of review to make sure that the documents that the compiling historian selects are a thorough, accurate, and reliable, objective documentation of the main lines of policy, the main lines of diplomacy. And then after we're satisfied kind of editorially within our office that a volume is the best kind of representation, documentary representation of the volume's focus, it goes out for that interagency declassification review. And the historians in our office are very involved in reviewing the responses that we get for that. What information are other people in the US government saying needs to be removed from those documents before they can be released? And we take those responses very seriously. In a lot of cases, their judgments they make a lot of sense. There's information in documents that is sensitive and should not be released at this time. But sometimes we push back. We say, hey, this is really important for understanding the broader picture, or we don't see how this is still sensitive. Can you kind of explain this to us in a little greater depth? And so at the end of the day, at the end of those deliberations, after both sides can kind of agree on a set of decisions about kind of redactions and excisions, that's when we do the technical work of taking a stack of documents and turning it into a book. So there are a couple dozen historians in the office who work on each of those various aspects of FRUS production. And it's really incredibly fascinating and rewarding work. So that's what the FRUS side of our office does. I'm actually working in a different part of the office that provides historical support for the department. And that takes the form of kind of taking the requests that come in from officials around the world. What kind of history do they need to learn and understand in order to pursue the current policy interests of the United States, in order to conduct diplomacy more effectively? And then we try to research and provide that to current officials and diplomats.
That's fascinating. And it's really good to know that it's that kind of dialogue that's happening, that the historians are pushing back and saying, this is very important for context. Can you explain more about why you might want to, why you think that needs to be removed or not? And even as you pointed out in your presentation, that noting when something has been redacted is not something that was always inherent to the publication. So it's clear based on your presentation that over time the process has improved so that even when information has to be removed for some reason, there's a conversation about why that is. There are notes so that the general public can understand that I'm not saying something here that was included. Mm-hmm. And that's really, I think, important for all of us as citizens to know. So question number 3, Michael asks, what's the longest delay between the events discussed in a volume of the Foreign Relations of the U.S. publication series and the actual publication of that volume? And he asks if you could also tell us what was the event or events being discussed that caused that, or not, maybe not caused, but that is part of that lag time.
Sure. So there's actually 2 ways I can answer that question. One speaks to the kind of editorial story I told you about in the presentation. The other speaks to the policy and the declassification side. I'll start with the editorial policy because our office, I think it was about 5 years ago, published a volume on public diplomacy during the World War I era that was, that covered activities that are a century old. And that wasn't because those activities were inherently sensitive or difficult to declassify. It was because the historians who compiled those volumes originally didn't perceive public diplomacy as a critical element of the nation's foreign policy. And in the century, or in the 80 or so years since those historians compiled that initial wave of World War I volumes, the public, the historical community, the Department of State itself sees public diplomacy as much more central to how we pursue our interests around the world. So we actually, as an office, circled back and covered those activities in retrospective volumes. The declassification side, I'm not sure it'll surprise anyone to hear that a volume documenting the US covert action in Iran in the 1950s took a very long time to release. It's actually, in some ways, linked because it's a retrospective volume. The office produced a volume that covered those events back in the 1980s, but it didn't include any documentation of the covert action, and it also didn't include a disclaimer that the volume was incomplete. And that's actually one of the proximate kind of causes of the Frus statute that I mentioned in my presentation, because Congress took note of the controversy that ensued after that volume was published and said, the State Department needs to get its act together and make sure that Frus continues to uphold these standards that it's established over the previous decades. In the aftermath of the statute, the Historical Advisory Committee urged our office to produce a retrospective volume that kind of applied the statutorily mandated standards to those events so that we could correct the record. And that volume was released in can't remember whether it was 2017 or 2018, and it covered events in 1951 to 1954. So it's about 60 plus years after the fact.
Wow. Yeah. So that actually ties into a question we got from Becky. And it sounds like over time there, you had to do some retrospectives. The standards weren't always clear. So moving forward, perhaps, is a more accurate way of asking this question. What is the amount of time that is, how much time is expected to lapse between the events? Is it months? Is it years? Does it depend? Yeah.
The statute specifies 30 years. That's by law, that's when we're supposed to publish. Frus has never met any of its deadlines. The first deadlines were established under Kennedy, and Frus flew right by them. Every time anybody's tried to say, this is the norm, this is the line that we've got to hold, it hasn't worked. So right now we're publishing volumes about 35 to 40 years after the events that the volumes contain. There's also, kind of just speaking in the immediate context, the pandemic really threw us for a loop in terms of our ability to access the documents that we need to compile the volumes. And it's also really disrupted the declassification process because so many people have been working from home, where obviously you can't have any classified systems or information. So there's going to be another kind of spike in the delay that's directly attributable to the pandemic, but we're doing what we can to chip away at that lag so that we get it back to the 30-year line established by Congress.
Okay, so that, Josh, that'll also relate to Grant's question, which is that looking at the website, at your website, the State Department's website, it appears that there are no volumes published after the Clinton administration. And so he's asking if, are those just awaiting publication, or are they, available elsewhere? It sounds like they're awaiting publication.
Sure. So the status of the series page that I assume Grant is referring to, that shows where the volumes that are currently in our production pipeline, where they sit in that pipeline. So the stages are being planned. So are we thinking through what kind of documents we need to review in order to make our selections about which documents go into a volume? Are they actively being produced, being compiled, being researched? That's when historians are actually looking at boxes and boxes and boxes of paper records to tease out which ones are the most essential to include in the volume. Or are they being kind of declassified? Have we completed the process of selecting the documents, pushed them through the declassification process? So the most recent volumes that are in that pipeline are the Clinton volumes. Those are the ones that we've established a plan. We kind of have an idea of the topics that we want to cover, the records we need to look at to assemble those volumes. But we haven't. I think there's one historian who's gone to the Clinton Library. So for the most part, we haven't actually started working on those volumes yet. And the way that the process works is that as we move into like the active research phase for a presidential administration, that's when we start to think about kind of, okay, what's the next administration going to look like when we put it in FRUS? So as we move into the Clinton administration in greater numbers, that's when we'll start a process in the office to figure out what the W Bush subseries should look like. So it's a rolling process, and we haven't started those discussions for the administrations after Clinton.
So Marilyn asks another question that actually serves as a good follow-up to this, and it's about where the documents themselves are being archived. And you just referenced the Clinton Library, which is one. The National Archives presumably would be another. And so she's asking, in addition to the FRUS series itself, how do individual researchers or journalists access the actual primary sources that might be referenced, in addition to I would consider the Foreign Relations of the U.S. series its own kind of primary source, even if it's referencing other things?
Sure, that's a great question. There are lots of ways to access government documents. And what we hope to do, one of the kind of applications that we hope FRUS has is a roadmap to a lot of documents that are not in between those covers, collections to consult, where those collections are housed, the archives that actually contain the material, references to specific other documents. But it sounds like Marilyn's interested in, okay, so where do I go? Like, what's the return address? And there are a lot of different answers to that, depending on what kinds of documents you're looking for. If you're looking for documents related to the foreign policy process, honestly, one of the best places to start is a presidential library, especially for modern administrations, because the policy process really begins and usually ends at the White House. And the presidential libraries contain all those presidential records. I know that each presidential library is kind of its own unique universe. So they're taking different strategies to making their resources available to researchers, especially remote researchers. Some libraries are really aggressively digitizing their declassified materials and putting it on their website so that more people have easier access to documents. The Clinton Library is actually a pretty good example of that. If you go to their website, you can search through a lot of declassified digitized documents. So depending on the time period, the Presidential Library might be the best place to start. If you're looking for older records, the National Archives recently completed a digitization project for all of the State Department's central files going up to, I think, 1910. And some of those are very difficult to use because they're digitized from microfilm. In a lot of cases, the original materials are handwritten, so it's not like a computer can run an OCR program and extract the text that you can search against. But it is there, and the archivists at NARA know those materials really well. So if you kind of use their reference staff to help you track down the specific collections, the specific materials that are relevant to your question, they can usually point you towards resources that are digitized. And I would also recommend the FOIA process. The Freedom of Information Act exists to give American citizens the ability to request information about the government's activities. And the FOIA covers material all the way back to the present. Like, you can FOIA something that was produced yesterday. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, but it is eligible for review and potential release if it meets the criteria in the statute. And the State Department has a FOIA page at foia.state.gov. Every agency in the executive branch maintains its own FOIA program. The presidential libraries are also under FOIA. So you can FOIA the presidential records that have not yet been declassified and try to get those released. So those are kind of the low-hanging fruit that I would point Maryland towards.
Excellent, Josh. And that also, it's just a reminder that just as the guidelines and laws that pertain to FRUS have evolved over the years, things like retention of presidential records is not something that has existed throughout the entire history of our country. And the federal presidential library system is a modern creation too. I mean, in general terms, a modern creation. So Phyllis has also, my colleague Phyllis has dropped into the chat a series of, or a list of websites that also provide resources that Josh provided to us that we are happy to pass on to all of you. Josh, you noted how many historians are involved in the Foreign Relations series. I think you said 12. And Pam asked, how many people are in the office of the Department of the Historian to do all of this hard work? So first of all, Pamela, thank you for recognizing that this is hard work. And appreciating that it does take a great deal of skill and focus and attention. And Josh, tell us how many colleagues do you have in the Office of the Historian?
So there are about 40 of us in the office. There are about 15 or 16 compilers, the first line historians who go into the archives and assemble the documents. There are also another half dozen or so more senior historians who undertake their review process that I described, to take the materials that are assembled by the compilers, make sure they meet the statutory requirements, make sure they adhere to the editorial guidance for the office, and kind of manage the kind of editorial process. And then we have a team of a few historians who kind of directly coordinate with the other agencies on the declassification process. And those are historians because as part of that declassification process, they inform reviewers who might not be aware when information that a reviewer says, oh, we can never release that, that would bring the world down. And that historian can say, actually, it's released here, 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 and here. And we all still seem to be here. So they play a really vital role in that process of familiarizing reviewers with the state of public knowledge. And so that's most of the FRUS staff. The more institutional history support staff, it's about a dozen of us on that side of the office.
Yeah. Josh, one final question. Your office fields questions from within the department and other agencies, as you've mentioned. because it's important for everyone to realize that this information is also being used and requested by diplomats, by others around the world who are looking to use this history as context for making decisions today, which is very important and gratifying to hear too, quite frankly. But you are also fielding questions from researchers and the general public. All things considered, what is the most common inquiry, or if it's easier, line of inquiry that you receive?
That's a great question. I mean, if I had to like give you a kind of modal answer, like the most frequent single that isn't representative of the universe, but the most frequent question or kind of question that we get is, when is this volume coming out? I want these documents. Why isn't it out yet? We get that a lot, and we're doing our best. We want these documents out as much as anyone else. In terms of kind of themes that people are interested in, it really is all over the map. We get really specific research focused questions from students and professors and teachers who want to kind of do their own history and seek our advice for where in the State Department's records can I find this kind of material. From policymakers, we get a range of questions. Some of them involve what the Department of State, just how it operated in the past. Sometimes it's kind of, what are the key milestones in our relationship with another country? What should I look out for in terms of public diplomacy messaging? Where are red lines that I shouldn't cross? In some cases, it's just, I need to actually know like the negotiating history of this. Like the other side is saying this happened and we said this. Is that true? Is that like, if we did say that, why did we say that? So it ranges all over the map, and it's really, I mean, that's one of the really exciting things about working on the kind of support side of the office, is that in some ways it's kind of terrifying to never know exactly what you're going to do on a given day, but in some ways it's really exciting to learn things that you never really even thought to ask.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Josh. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today in sharing about this very important historical resource that is really not only capturing the history of the foreign relations of the US, but so many other aspects of the American system of government and the experiment in democracy. I love the fact that the existence of this series is itself a representation of that. So thank you again, Josh. Thank you all for joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Phyllis.
Yes, thank you, Josh. I know everyone has really enjoyed the opportunity to hear more about government transparency and diplomatic history dating back to 1861, and of course, Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward. It's very interesting. If you haven't already registered for our upcoming webinar, then I would encourage you to visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org and sign up soon. Next up on our 4-Score series will be featuring Dr. Carolyn Janey on Tuesday, April 12th, for a discussion on her recent book, Ends of War, The Unfinished Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox, and we hope that you will all join us. When you close out today's webinar, you will see a short survey. Please take a moment to complete the survey, as it does help us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you'd like to see in the future. We are grateful for each member and donor and sincerely appreciate your ongoing generous support of our foundation. Until next time, we thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye.